May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, here we are at the start of the third week of the Lenten season. 2 more Sundays after this, and then Holy Week begins with Palm Sunday. It was just a couple of weeks ago on Ash Wednesday that I read from the Ash Wednesday service in the prayer book, the invitation to you to keep a holy Lent. An invitation that ends with a call to make a right beginning by repentance. Repentance. That is a strong, recurring theme of the Lenten season. And yet, quite often, the word repentance is grossly misunderstood in our culture. I remember asking a confirmation class once, it was a group of high schoolers, what they thought the word repentance meant. And they pretty much generally agreed that they thought the word repentance meant feeling bad about yourself. Well, that is not what the word repentance means. But high school students aren't the only ones who have that impression. Repentance does not mean feeling bad about yourself. In fact, the Greek word that is translated as repentance literally means to change your mind. Not in that kind of fickle sort of way, what is it we like to say, flip-flopping? Not in that way, but to change your mind, your whole way of seeing, your whole way, your heart, your whole way of looking at the world, to change the way you think about something, to have a whole different picture in mind about how you work and how the world works and how God works. It's that kind of changing of mind that repentance means. And the gospel passage that we read this morning actually is the last little piece of a whole series of passages in Luke where Jesus has been speaking to a very large mixed crowd about changing their minds concerning all sorts of things. He's talked to them about changing their minds, about what and whom they are afraid. He's talked to them about changing their minds concerning what kind of treasure they give their hearts to. He's talked to them about changing their minds concerning worry and anxiety, encouraging them to put their trust in God and be peaceful. And because of an issue raised by a person in the crowd, in this morning's gospel passage, he's talking to the crowd about changing their mind concerning the part God plays in disasters and tragedies. Now, this is the part I want to take a closer look at this morning. But before we do, I just want to mention this odd little parable of the fig tree that comes at the very end. Because it is the end, not just of today's reading, it's the end of this whole section where Jesus has been talking about changing one's mind, about repentance as changing one's mind, about all of these things. And in the parable, what we hear is that that kind of change of mind doesn't come quickly. That it requires tending and care, and sometimes going to extra measures for God to help us change our minds, for God to help us change the way that we see things. So with that understanding in mind, that understanding that God will always work with us to make whatever changes in our life are necessary, let's take a closer look at this change that Jesus speaks of in this morning's gospel. Changing the mind about the part God plays when disaster strikes. Now, during the time of Jesus, it was commonly believed that suffering was inflicted upon people by God because they had displeased him. We even see that carried over into New Testament times and in the letter that we read from Paul this morning. Paul still had that same semblance in that letter, though other places Paul seems to talk very differently. But we see that attitude that was very much a part of that culture, to think that when disaster or tragedy struck an individual or a family or a community, it was because of something that they had done to displease God. On the other hand, It was understood that blessings came as rewards to those who had pleased God very much. So it really was kind of a logical, clear-cut way of making judgments about things, and also of maintaining some semblance, or at least thinking you could maintain a semblance of control in your life. Because obviously, if the people who suffered had done something wrong, then how could you avoid suffering? Just don't do anything wrong. Do everything you're supposed to do, and you can ensure God's protection for yourself, your family, your tribe, your people, your nation. If you all did exactly what was right and what you were supposed to do, then you could kind of control whether suffering came or not. And if you were particularly good at what you did, you would be richly blessed. That would have been the typical way of thinking for that large crowd that was gathered around Jesus on that day. Typical way of thinking for whoever it was who raised the issue of a recent tragedy in Jerusalem. We don't know much about that tragedy. This is the only time it's mentioned in the Gospels. But just what we can pick up, we know that it had something to do with some Galilean pilgrims who had come to Jerusalem to make their sacrifices at the temple, and that while they were there, they had been massacred as a group. And we know that Pontius Pilate would have been the one ordering that massacre. So obviously, he already had a reputation. People knew he was a violent tyrant. But even knowing that, there were obviously whispers going through the crowd about the Galileans. What had they done that was so wrong, that would cause God to let them suffer such a cruel fate? And that wasn't the only tragedy that apparently had happened recently. Jesus even brings up another, and he says, hey, remember a few days back, maybe a week or so ago, the tower that fell, killed 18 citizens of Jerusalem? Rumors probably were circulating throughout Jerusalem about what those poor folks must have done to bring such tragedy upon themselves. You see, shocked by these disasters and the untimely death of all these people, those who were not directly touched by the tragedy would have comforted themselves by thinking that there certainly must have been a reason for such suffering, that it certainly must have come about through some fault of the victim. And unfortunately, this kind of cause and effect thinking about pain and suffering, this blame the victim mentality, is still somewhat with us today. For example, shortly after the earthquake in Haiti, Time magazine reported a claim that was made by the Reverend Pat Robertson the day after the disaster, the very next day. According to the report, Robertson claimed that the earthquake was divine retribution, or a pact that he said the Haitian leaders made years ago with the French government to gain their freedom. That's what he said. Day after the awful devastation in Haiti, audaciously, while the 800 number for relief was scanning across the bottom of the screen.